Hello, and welcome back to another episode of C-Suite Unplugged. I'm your host, Adam Legg, and in this series, I talk to Alberta's top CEOs, entrepreneurs, and business leaders about their journey to the C-suite, what keeps them up at night, their perspective as a leader in their industry, and their outlook on the future. If you find this episode interesting or insightful, let us know by heading over to Apple Podcasts or Spotify and leaving us a quick review and rating. Now, on to the show. Other than people who are truly terrified to fly, I don't know anyone who isn't somehow swept away by airplanes and air travel. These amazing machines that defy gravity, take us to exciting destinations, and are the source of childhood awe over generations. Today's C-Suite Unplugged guest is Alexis von Hoensbroech, the CEO of WestJet. Alexis is a relatively new Albertan, having moved here during the pandemic to take the helm of Canada's best airline, which just so happens to be an Alberta success story. Alexis brings a truly global experience, having led Austrian Airlines and senior roles in other parts of the Lufthansa Group. He's one of the most passionate and articulate spokespeople for competitiveness and good, pragmatic government public policy. We're also excited to have him join the BCA Board of Directors recently. This will be a fascinating discussion that I know you'll enjoy. Well, Alexis, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for inviting me, Adam.
Alexis, I think it's fair to say one of the first things folks notice is you have a bit of a different accent than what we've heard at the helm of WestJet before. Tell us your story and your journey between leaving your home nation and arriving here in Alberta.
Yeah, I know I have an accent. I sound like a villain in a James Bond movie. That's what people have to live with, but I'm not. So for a positive side. Yeah. So I joined WestJet almost 3 years ago. So I've become almost a Canadian by now. Built my first hockey rink in the backyard, so I've become a Canadian. So to a certain extent, maybe in parts because my family and I, we really love Canada. It's a great country, and Alberta is a great province to live in. I know that many people that live in Canada are sometimes frustrated about certain things, but if you look at the country from the outside, it's actually a very attractive country to go to. And when my wife and I considered the WestJet opportunity, one of the strongest reasons to accept it was actually that it was in Canada. Canada, out of Europe, is seen as a great and beautiful country. It has all the upsides of America, and that actually makes it too attractive to go there. So that's why we're here. Before that, I've had a various chain of different careers that I pursued in my life. Mm-hmm. So when I left school, I originally wanted to become a scientist. So my very first career was actually to become a scientist. So I studied physics in school and university. I did my PhD in astrophysics. I worked at the Max Planck Institute for radio astronomy, and I was researching neutron stars with big radio telescopes, which was a pretty exciting thing to do. But it was also a bit over-specialized, and it's a bit lonely in certain sense. There was only a very small community of people worldwide that actually were working in the similar fields, so that was just became a bit lonely. So I decided I want to get back amongst people, and then started my second career. I had zero experience in business, but I was already 28 years of age. It was actually not easy to find a company that would employ someone who has no idea about business. And then one day when I was having a beer with a friend, and I asked him what kind of companies would employ someone like me who has no idea about business but still wants to be in business. And he said, well, probably difficult, but the only type of companies that do actually employ people that don't know anything about business are business consultants. So maybe you should give it a try. So I thought, okay, I'll give it a try. Sent out my resume to a couple of consulting firms and actually got an offer from the Boston Consulting Group, actually one of the biggest and best known consulting firms. They gave me an offer and I accepted and went there. So that was my career number 2, that I became a consultant. Worked there for 6 years. It was actually a great time because they gave me a very comprehensive training in business, and then they put me on the job, and then I did one project after another in all sorts of different industries and fields. And the best thing to learn is to learn it on the job. That's how I actually learned business and actually had lots of fun with it. And so I decided I want to stay in business. But then again, one day I thought consulting is nice, but being accountable yourself is maybe even better. So then I decided I want to move on and take a real job in a real sort of in a company that produces something that is beyond consulting. That was also at the time when I actually met my wife, and we also thought that consulting doesn't really fit with our desire to grow a family because there was just too much trouble involved. And while we were sort of in this process, I suddenly got an offer from one of my biggest client that I was serving, which was Lufthansa, the Lufthansa Group, the German/European airline group. And they offered me a job. They knew me from quite a few projects, and I accepted. So that was in 2005. And then I went into Lufthansa. They hired me to run their strategy department of the Lufthansa airline. And then from there, I just went through the company and did lots of different things, and eventually got my role in 2018 as the CEO of Austrian Airlines, which is a subsidiary of Lufthansa in Austria. So I was basically running the national airline of Austria. That's when I took my first CEO type of role. And then went to the pandemic, and that was obviously very, very difficult, and maybe we can cover that later or not. But after 4 years, I got to the point that I thought, what am I going to do with the last third of my professional life? And will I stay in the Lufthansa Group, or maybe go on a new endeavor? And my wife and I both thought maybe it's interesting to look out for some new opportunities. And then the WestJet opportunity came up. So actually several opportunities came up, but the WestJet opportunity was the one that attracted us the most because of the country, because of the reputation of the company, the entrepreneurial spirit. I also actually quite like the idea to work for a company that is owned by private equity. The company I worked for before was a publicly traded company, a huge company, very political, very bureaucratic. And I thought working in private equity actually should be pretty straightforward because there's only one thing that counts, which is success. That's also what I like to drive. And so we got to know each other, we got to like each other. And then eventually my wife and I arrived in Calgary on a day that has minus 35 degrees of temperature. It was a tough start. But I told my wife, from here it can only get better. And it did.
What a great story, Alexis. And the number of people who I've heard who landed in Calgary having come from somewhere else on a very cold day. My wife, the same. She came time from Mexico City, and it was in February and pretty cold. So often not the best first impression for newcomers, but glad you stuck with it and have settled here with your family.
Yeah, I actually like the Canadian winter. The European winter is a bit like Vancouver. So it's around 0 degrees, rain, gray, muddy. So I actually prefer a real winter like this one. Cold, but lots of snow, always sunshine, mountains pretty close. And from a business perspective, I always say the winter is our best salesman because everyone wants to fly on WestJet to a nice sunny destination during winter, which we like to do. So
I agree, and you'll be taking us down to Punta Cana in March next year. So looking forward to that.
Looking forward to that.
Are there many parallels in your original career in astrophysics and the Max Planck Institute with what you find yourself doing today? Whether it's sort of challenges or decision-making process, anything that you feel that uniquely parallels and ports over to the airline sector?
Yes and no. I think the only thing that basically goes universally across all these things is basically analytics. When you're in science, then all you have is an analytical toolkit and experiments that create data, and then you use the analytics to process the data, you build theories and so on. So that's methodologically pretty similar in business. That's how you work as a consultant, and that's how you also should work when you're in business. So be data-driven, be analytical, being connect dots, being creative about what could be behind a certain set of data and so on. So this is a skill that I think is very, very useful in anything you do in life, including business. But that's about the only thing that transfers from being a scientist to being a businessman. So.
Fair enough. Yes, you always got to analyze things properly and thoroughly, and
you better do, and some don't. So you better do.
I can only imagine the number of things you could analyze in the aviation sector must be incredible. It's
a terribly complex business for sure, and because you're dealing with very, very expensive assets, and these assets, unlike most other industries, these assets are actually not static. They move around. So as you know, one of the most important levers that you have in any business is where you deploy your assets. Now, our assets, you can deploy them here today and there tomorrow. So how you deploy them and how you optimize the system is obviously a very, very analytical thing that you need to crack, or very complex thing that you need to crack. And there are many, many factors that go into it. You know, when you think about how to plan a network, how to marry physical assets like airplanes with human assets, like crew, that you have to plan on this, and that also all have their own rules. And then you have your day of operations where things sometimes, get disturbed because there's a delay here, a cancellation there, a blizzard, or whatever, mechanical, you have a lightning strike, you name it. Something is always happening in operation like ours, that you also need to have proper tools to actually recover and get back into a steady state. There are lots of complexities. And many people like to jump to conclusion. And I know we have close to 30 million guests pretty soon. So that basically means there are also 30 million armchair coaches on how to run an airline. And if you're in it, then you actually find out how complex it is and how many things you actually have to consider when you take decisions, and why some things that look pretty obvious from the outside are actually much more difficult when you're on the inside and having to deliver on it. But for this, it's actually good to have an analytical background, and that certainly helps me and many others as well.
Yeah, we'll talk a little later about just not only the complexity, but the number of actors in a passenger journey, but everybody just sort of focuses on the airline, which could be a real challenge for the sector. But back to you for a second. How would you describe your leadership style and philosophy? How do you define that?
There's no single answer, and maybe this question will be better addressed to someone who works with me than to me myself. But I think I'm very collaborative in nature. I'm someone who really loves to work in a high-performing team. I'm someone who actually likes to be challenged and to wrestle over what the right solution is. And that's how I try to run the business. And I think it also works quite often well. And sometimes, of course, there can also be challenges around it, but I really like to work with people that are very skilled and that know what they're doing, and that also challenge me, because I don't think that an idea that I have is necessarily the right idea just because it's from me. So I'm always looking for having many, many views and then coming up with whatever is the best. But I also like to drive things forward. I think I'm someone who is constantly thinking about how can we change what we do in order to be set up in a better place for the future, because our future is also, our environment is super dynamic. And if you don't adjust to your environment, then you'll eventually be in trouble. Yeah, maybe it's because of the pace of change. Maybe it's not always easy to work with me, but I hope I'm creating an environment where people also feel that there's psychological safety, and that's actually also fun to work in. So that's how I hope I am, but maybe you should address this question to someone who works with me and can give you more objective view on what it is.
Sure. I'll ask the next flight attendant on my next WestJet flight.
Okay.
Work with you. Do you find, is there any difference in the leadership styles and approaches and corporate cultures in Europe where you began your career to what you're finding in Canada?
I would say the differences are most subtle. It's not a very, very fundamental difference. At the end of the day, running an airline is running an airline. There are things that are different naturally. We have different demand patterns, we have different regulation, different labor law, and so on. But that's just the nature of working in a different country. There are cultural elements, although I think the European culture and the North American culture, they are relatively similar compared to what you would find across other continents or even within the different European countries. So that's pretty okay and pretty easy. There are some subtle things that are different. So I'm German, and I think Germans are known to be sometimes very direct and very open, and to the point that some people sometimes think this is a little offensive. All Germans are straight, but it's actually not. It's being straightforward and then agree on something and then move on. While Canadians are, in my perception, they're great. Sometimes they're always super, super nice. Sometimes a little bit too nice, and sometimes too nice to say no. There is a component of saying yes, but meaning no and then doing no. And it took me some time to figure out this type of passive aggressiveness that sometimes happens. So you think you have an agreement, but then a week later you found out that there was no agreement, but no one told you. So these are like these subtle things that I needed to find my way through, but it's all good. And it's a great team to work with, and it's a great culture. And I really love the Canadian way of life. And also, the way we have been embraced as a family, and we have landed here in this city and this country is just fabulous.
Great. Good to hear. Yeah. I can't remember. I think I'm getting it slightly wrong, but I think the Canadian no is, for sure, or something like that. We kick that down the road to continue to be nice. But Alexis, what do you do outside the office? What occupies your time? Any hobbies? I know you've got a family, but what do you do for fun?
I got a family with 5 kids in school age, so this keeps my wife and myself pretty busy. And when I come home, then it happens from time to time that then I also take over, and my wife says, no, it's your turn with the kids, which is totally fine. We share this. But there are obviously also other things that we do outside work. I run a lot, do some workouts, and also need this to balance the day-to-day work. But we also love to spend time in the nature. In winter we go skiing, and summer we go hiking. We beautiful things in this great country. Spring break last year we went to, while everyone flew down to the Caribbean, we went down to the Northwest Territory and spent time in a lodge in a distant place and did ice fishing and so on. Or this summer we went a weekend to a very remote place in British Columbia and did a 1-week canoe tour on some lakes, remote with no cell connection. So these type of things we really like. Canada is one of the best places to enjoy nature and to enjoy the environment. And these are things that we really love to do as a family.
Oh, that's great. We should also mention you've recently joined Business Council of Alberta's board. Thank you for agreeing to do that.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's a great organization, Business Council of Alberta, and it plays a very important role in giving the Alberta business a voice and working with both the province and the federal government to improve conditions for businesses, which at the end of the day are creating all the wealth and all the employment and all the things that this country actually benefits from. So I'm very happy to be working alongside with you and all the other great people at the Business Council of Alberta. So thanks for having me.
Oh, we're lucky to have you. Your global experience, you're the head of one of Alberta's biggest companies and Canada's best airline, headquartered here in Alberta. So we're privileged to have you. We're privileged to have you. I'd be curious, how many plane flights a year do you do, not only as an executive going across the country and meeting with lots of different partners and airports and stakeholders, but you must be on quite a few planes every year.
Yeah, for sure. I fly a lot, but maybe not as much as you may think, because running an airline is actually, we have our headquarters in Calgary, and for the most part, I'm working with Calgary. We also have some functions in Toronto, especially after we purchased Sunwing. So therefore, and obviously our owners are also in Toronto, Onyx. So I'm in Toronto relatively frequently. And the other places I visit occasionally because we have people working in Vancouver and Edmonton and Winnipeg, Montreal, and so on. But this is not that often. Compared to people that run other multinationals, I think they actually travel even more than I do. It's actually quite good. Traveling now and then, but not too much, which is also family. I also like to see my wife and my kids from time to time. That works actually pretty well.
Exactly. It's important to be home for that. Alexis, let's move on to WestJet and the world of Canadian aviation. Give us a snapshot of the WestJet company. You have the airline, as you just mentioned a few minutes ago. You've acquired Sunwing. So tell us a little bit about the full portfolio of the company.
Yeah, so WestJet, by the way, a homegrown Calgarian Albertan success story, started a bit more than 28 years ago with 3 airplanes and 290 people when on the day that the first flight. So by now we have about 200 airplanes across the group. We have about 15,000 people working for the WestJet Group. We are the home carrier for Western Canada to start with. We are also the leading airline for vacation flying all across Canada, coast to coast. We strengthened this positioning by acquiring Sunwing. Now, when we acquired Sunwing, we actually acquired 2 different businesses. One is a tour operator. That's a company that sells package tours. So that's a package of a hotel and a flight and some destination services, $1,499 for a week in Cancun. So that's what they do as a tour operator. And then they also have an airline. Now, the airline we are currently integrating into WestJet, into the WestJet airline. This is going to be completed in April. And then we have one big airline where all those airplanes are in. And the tour operator will stay separate as a Sunwing tour operator, Sunwing Vacations. It's a very strong brand all across Canada, but with the specific strength in the East. And therefore, it's actually very important to keep it. That's how we are set up. We have bases where people that are employed by WestJet are actually working in Calgary, which is the biggest, but also in Edmonton, in Vancouver, in Winnipeg, in Toronto, and Montreal. So 6 different cities, and there are between a few hundred and a few thousand people in each of those cities that work for WestJet For the most part, it's crew, pilots, and flight attendants. But in some of those places, it's also airport staff and aircraft maintenance engineers that fix our airplanes. It's a pretty big and pretty diverse type of business that we're operating across the country.
And when someone goes through a WestJet journey, most of the people I imagine they encounter are WestJetters, as you call them. But are there other parts of that journey that are not part of the WestJet experience? Obviously, the airport and the security people, but it's important to distinguish where they're actually interacting with the airline and where they're not.
Yeah, no, thanks for taking this up. Now, obviously, running an airline is a terribly complex thing because on one hand, you're operating a complex business in its own right, but then you're also dependent on so many other parties. Yeah, so we can only fly airplanes from airports to airports, so we obviously need our airport partners to work with us. But then even the airport partners don't control everything that's happening on the ground. So there are like CATSA that does all the security screening independent of the airport, within the airport, but independently managed. We have CBSA, who does all the border control. We have the US border control that is also happening in Canadian airports. We have ground handling companies that help us on the ground. So we talk about above the wing and below the wing. So above the wings are the people that you meet in the airport. So people at check-in and baggage and at boarding. But then there are obviously also people that work below the wing and do all the fuel services and baggage handling and cargo handling and you name it, pushback. And these are usually also third parties. And then we do this across more than 100 different airports that we actually fly to across the world. So we fly from one airport to the other. And if the other airport is on Caribbean island, then you have the entire set up on that island as well, which again adds to the complexity of suppliers that you have to manage. So that's one part. Then once the aircraft is in the air, you are dealing with air traffic control, which guides the aircraft through the airspace and makes sure that nothing happens and everything is safe. But you also depend on them being properly staffed, that they can actually process the number of airplanes in a given airspace, which is sometimes a challenge. And then you're also dealing with a whole bunch of suppliers. Yeah? So we get our airplanes from Boeing for the most part, and Boeing has been in the media lately for being in trouble for various reasons, and they've been very slow in delivering airplanes. We have engine manufacturers that build engines that sometimes don't live up to their performance criteria, which basically means they have to have more shop visits. So we need more spare engines, and sometimes we don't get those spare engines. So the aircraft actually sits on the ground because it turned from a jet into a glider plane with no engines on because they're in the shop. And so there are these type of challenges that we have to maneuver through every single day that keep us awake day and night to make this all work. An airline that flies on time and operates all its aircraft requires all those parties to effectively and smoothly work together. You have one party that screws it up, and then it creates an entire chain of problems that's impacting this very flight, but then also propagates to the system because a plane that's late on one flight will naturally be also late by the next flight. Yeah? And there are lots of other things that happen. Now, everything that happens is always at the fault of the airline. Yeah? So if you talk to guests, they will only tell you, well, the WestJet plane was late. They will never tell you, oh, the ground handling company was unprepared, or oh, the ACC air traffic control in Vancouver was short-staffed. By the way, the main reason for delays last year that we had to have short-staffing air traffic controllers in Vancouver. Yeah, so that's just the reality that we are fighting with.
Yeah. It's an incredibly complex and coordinated dance, right? Every person has to be moving at the perfect cadence and pace if you're going to be on time and perfect experience. And as you say, one little slip up knocks the whole thing over. And to your point, everybody does look at the airline. You bought the ticket from them, and that's the interaction, even though it may not necessarily be the fault of the airline.
We understand that. We understand that, and that's okay. They have the contract with us to travel. But what sometimes will drive me crazy is when then politicians hear all the anger and then they step in to regulate the industry with an attempt to make it better. And then they propose things like air passenger protection rights. Now, obviously, we respect the passenger rights that are there. But the way they set it up is, in my view, is actually pretty insane, because they basically single out airlines. They say if the airline is at the fault of a delay, then there has to be a compensation. Because if the airline is short-staffed, it's a management failure of the airline. So the airline has to pay money. But if we are delayed because air traffic control in Vancouver is short-staffed, then it's actually not a management failure, but it's an act of God. It's like a flood or an earthquake or a blizzard. So it's an act of God, and therefore the passenger is not entitled to receive a compensation. So now we have an airplane that starts in Vancouver, is delayed by 3 hours. Then the people that fly from Vancouver to Toronto on that flight, on the delayed flight, they maybe get it, that this is because of air traffic controller shortage. But then this very same plane carries these 3 or 4 hours delay into its next flight from Toronto to Cancun. Now you tell the passengers on Toronto to Cancun that their flight is delayed by 4 hours because air traffic control shortage in Vancouver, which it is. But then they think that we are trying to trick them. So as they don't get the compensation, then they complain to the Canadian Transportation Agency that we are not paying the compensation that they're entitled to. So then the claims pile up at the Canadian Transportation Agency for all these reasons. And then this agency again complains to us that because of all of the delays that they think that we own, the Canadians pile up complaints at this agency. So it's just, they have created a monster that has gone out of control and unfortunately doesn't improve air travel, because if you only single out one party of a very complex system, then you won't improve it unless you encompass the accountability for air travel to all parties, including ports and including navigation, including security, and all those parties that can potentially cause a delay or cancellation. But as long as this is not the case, it's just what it is. It will just impose lots of costs to the system and will not improve air travel. And this is exactly how it went in Europe, where they had it for 20 years now, and there's been zero improvement to air travel, but there have been billions and billions of costs being created to the system that are driving up ticket prices.
Mm-hmm. You've had one heck of a year in 2024, Alexis. You've had challenges you alluded to earlier with Boeing, some of their production. You've had hailstorm that took out a number of aircraft that I think are still out of commission today. You had labor disruptions both on the pilot and the mechanic side. So my heart goes out to you trying to run a business with all of those disruptions happening. And I'm curious, is there anything you're seeing that might give you some more confidence or optimism for stability into the future? And do you think we need to do anything to create more stability for the airline sector? We'll talk a little bit more about the competitiveness and the cost issue in a second, but in some of that particular labor disruption, anything that you see that we can be doing better or needs to happen?
Yeah, no, first of all, I'm actually very confident that things are looking good. We've achieved a lot this year, despite all the challenges. We didn't receive the airplanes from Boeing, so we acquired actually the entire aircraft fleet that was left over from Lynx Air that went bankrupt in February. So this allows us to grow, and we have seen quite some growth in the course of this year. We will receive a few more airplanes next summer, and as we go and look into next year, we see very strong growth again. That's especially Alberta will see, but also Vancouver and Toronto will see quite some growth, and Winnipeg will see quite some growth. So we are actually delivering a lot to the communities, and that makes a lot of impact for the communities. Just Alberta, I think we have grown by almost 50% over the last 2 years, and we have turned Calgary to be the best connected mid-sized city across all of North America, which has tremendous positive impact on the economy of Calgary and of all of Alberta, and is creating lots of second and third order positive effects to the community. And if you look at a place like Calgary, you get here by air or you don't. Yeah? So having a great air connectivity is probably the single most important thing you can do to develop the economy in this city over almost any other economic stimulus that you can do. And I just read a statistic the other day that Calgary has been the city with the highest growth of tech talent across all of North America in the last 5 years. And guess why? Because we created this tremendous network of now around 90 non-stop destinations that we serve out of Calgary. That's even a very, very fluid and high demand group like tech talent chooses to live in Calgary because the standard of living is high and you get almost everywhere you want to go on a direct flight. Yeah, so there are lots of great things that make us very excited because we don't just run a business that works, we also deliver something extremely meaningful to the community and to the communities that we serve. So that's the positive. Now, of course, there are challenges. Every year there will be some kind of challenges, and aviation, there's never a dull day. And we had some tough ones this year, for sure. We had 2 labor disputes that became a bit rough, and we also had actually 2 days of strike. By the way, a strike that should have never have happened. The reason it happened was because in a very contentious moment of the negotiation, the Minister of Labor Federal Minister of Labor stepped in to actually end the dispute by sending us to arbitration. But the way it was done was it was delivered in an incomplete way, which actually left a door open for the union to still go on strike, despite the Minister of Labor having sent us to arbitration. Mm-hmm. So this actually then created a strike that I think maybe otherwise wouldn't have happened. I know the Minister of Labor had to look for a new job afterwards, and we had to deal with the fallout of the strike, which was obviously terrible. However, we have now got to an agreement with the union, and we are now working constructively with the union, and we have a 5-year contract with them, so there won't be any dispute over the foreseeable period of time. And actually, as of now, or since then, every single contract that we have with any union is closed, and it will stay closed until, I think the next one that opens is by the end of next year. So we have a period of full labor stability. And generally, first contracts are always more contentious than second and third contracts. This one was the first one. So I'm actually pretty optimistic that the next negotiations that we have will come with less noise than the past ones. So that was a one-off, obviously in a very busy period of time, cost disruption, which we feel very, very sorry that this was done to our guests. And as we were just getting out of this in early August, we were then hit by this famous hailstorm that was, I learned, I think the second most expensive insurance event ever in the history of Canada, $2.8 billion of damage. And this is basically all damage in Northeast Calgary. Yep. That's accumulated to that level. And this was devastating. So the airport was severely hit. We had a number of airplanes on the ground at the time, and there were 19 airplanes that were heavily impacted. And they were basically all taken out of business. We had 83,000 dents in our airplanes. Every single dent needs to be measured, whether it's still within limits that we can operate or whether we need to change it. We had hundreds and hundreds of spare parts that we needed to get. And this was 10% of our fleet that was taken out in 20 minutes. Yeah? So this was really tough in the high season and basically had ripple effects all through the rest of August. This was tough to our guests. And again, something that we feel very sorry for. Having said this, both events, both the labor and the hailstorm, were event-driven disruption. Since then, our operation has actually been very, very smooth. And right now, we feel very good.
Alexis, as we move to close here in the final few minutes, let's talk a little bit about some of the public policy that affects the airline sector. You were in Ottawa last week testifying in front of the Transportation Committee. They were bringing you in under the auspices of the fees that you're charging for some of the lower cost levels, but you delivered a message to them, which was really important, that I think is something that they need to hear, that it's really in many ways not the airline charges that are causing affordability for Canada airline travel. It's their own costs and services and airport rents. But tell us, what are some of the major messages and public policy issues you're trying to take on right now?
Yeah, exactly. I was actually pretty upset. Yeah? So the parliamentary committee and the Minister of Transport, they basically summoned me and other airline CEOs to Ottawa to roast us over baggage fees. And I thought this was just one of those cases, go on airline bashing and try to play the political theater while they don't recognize the amount of problems that they actually own. So 2 things. First of all, we introduced a product called Ultra Basic in June. This Ultra Basic allows you to get the cheapest possible price if you don't check a bag or if you don't bring a large carry-on bag that goes into overhead bin space. Well, as we introduced it, we actually lowered the price for our tickets by 14%. So it is actually cheaper than what it was before. And since then, we had 1.2 million Canadians that bought an ultra basic fare and did not buy a checked bag. So they actually had the full saving of these 14%. So they voted with their feet. They actually like it. And then against this backdrop, the politicians try to make a case that we are price gouging our guests, and we do the exact opposite. We give them choice. I always say it's like at McDonald's. You shouldn't force everyone at McDonald's to buy a value deal, because some people maybe want just a cheeseburger and no fries and not a Coke and save some money. And we do exactly this. If someone doesn't want to pay for the price of a checked bag or for an overhead bin space, then they shouldn't. They should get a cheaper price. It's all about choice. And Canadians are grown up. They know what they want, and they know that they can take their choices and then don't need the choices to be made by politicians. Now, having said all this, there's a different side to it, which is that government-controlled fees and charges and taxes have just gone out of control. And these charges and taxes, they are not optional. Our fees are optional. Government-controlled fees are not optional. They are mandatory. And they collectively sum up to easily on around $100 per ticket. Just as a comparison, in the US, the same comparable number would be 28. So this is 3 times more expensive than in the US. And if you look over the last 30 years, airfares, so what airlines are being paid, went down by about 50%. That's the real affordability improvement that airlines have delivered. I'm not sure whether there are many other industries that have delivered a similar saving. In the same periods of time, government-induced taxes, fees, and charges went up by 2/3, and they continue going up. This year alone, security fees went up by 33%. Now, I don't see 33% more agents at the security screening.
Or faster.
So this was just a money grab of the federal government into the pockets of travelers. That's what it is. Because the security fees that our passengers pay, they don't go to CATSA. They go to the federal budget. It's just a money grab. So they do all these things that drives up the mandatory part of cost of travel. And then they accuse us for introducing an optional fee against a lower ticket price. I thought this was really insane, and I thought I need to speak up to this. And that's what I did. And that's why I went to Ottawa.
Good for you. Yeah, just some of the worst pricing misinformation and misdirection that the feds are trying to put on to the airlines. And you're creating an option of choice, whereas there's no choice to not pay the NAVCAN fee or the CATSA fee or an airport improvement fee because they've got to pay airport rents. It's just, it's insane.
I'm not sure whether Canadians know that, but airports, they have to pay a massive rent payment to the federal government. Yeah. So that's like almost $500 million a year that they pay to the federal government as a rent. There shouldn't be a rent. Why should there be a rent that airports pay? Airports should use this money to either pay down their debt or invest into infrastructure or lower their airport improvement fees, but not to fund the federal budget. That's just insane. I mean, one could argue whether the air infrastructure should be paid by passengers or not. So if you look at Via Rails, for instance, they are being heavily subsidized by the federal government. So why do you subsidize rail, which is a mode of transportation that almost no Canadians use, while the one mode of transportation that all Canadians use is actually a source of funding for the federal government far beyond what it actually costs. So it's actually the party that makes most money in aviation is the federal government. That's a reality, and that's what passengers pay for. By the way, just a little thought experiment. If we don't want anyone to subsidize our business, but if we were to get the same level of per passenger subsidy that Via Rail gets, we could not just fly everyone for free. We could even hand out cash to every passenger that goes into our aircraft. That's the insanity. Yeah? That's also this inequity that exists in this country, and that I think needs to be addressed. That's just wrong. For a mode of transportation that is essential in a country where most people don't get anywhere unless they take an airplane. This fences off millions of Canadians from being able to afford an aircraft and a flight on an airplane because all these fees and taxes and charges are so high. And this is far higher than any other country that I know. And that's just wrong and needs a serious reform and needs a government that actually addresses this and does something about it.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised that little bit on the subsidy from Via Rail. I was going to ask you to tell that one because it's just so mind-boggling, particularly in a country, as you say, that's so big that unless you're willing to spend days in the car, most people decide to travel by air. There's another statistic I've heard you mention before that if some of these taxes and fees were reduced, it would stimulate some additional demand. Could you just maybe touch on that real quickly?
Oh, for sure. So we know that this industry is very price elastic. So we know from all our models that we use in revenue management how many additional passengers you can actually stimulate, which means allow them to fly because they can afford it if you lower the price. So if we apply our models that are pretty accurate and well tested, if we apply them and just make the assumption that government fees and taxes would be half of what they are today. So this would be more in line with where other countries are. This would stimulate additional demand that would be sufficient to feed another airline of the size of WestJet. In other words, the number of people that are being fenced off being able to afford a plane ticket through these sky-high fees and charges and taxes that the government imposes or the government and government-controlled entities impose on airlines. So that's why the entire model needs to be reworked. And it's not rocket science. Yeah? So all they need to do is to look around the world, go to similar countries like the US, like Australia, like in Europe, like in a couple of other areas, and just learn from what they do well and what they do bad, and adapt those things that they do great. And there may not be the one country that does everything right, but pick from the best and use all these components to set up an aviation system that is modern and that is adequate for a country of the geography like Canada that needs aviation more than almost any other country in the world.
Yeah. Well, that's well said, Alexis. And not only thank you for your leadership at WestJet, your leadership on our board, but leadership in advocating for what is ultimately a good thing for Canadian consumers and ease of travel across this big country. So anything else you'd like to leave with our listeners before we close?
Now, looking into next year, we're actually pretty confident as well. We will be delivering on some big improvements for our guests. First of all, we'll be integrating the Sunwing airline, which is a big deal. We will be reconfiguring our airplanes. So we have a lot of airplanes right now through all those various airline integrations that have a non-standard configuration. So all our WestJet airplanes, there's the premium seats in front and then a normal economy class behind that. We have the former Swoop airplanes, we have the former Sunwing airplanes, and the former Lynx airplanes that all come in all economy class configuration, which is tough for our guests because all the people that like to fly premium, they actually don't find a premium seat. So that's creating quite some dissatisfaction. In the course of next year, we will reconfigure all of these airplanes. So there will be still a period of time when this is there, but we will reconfigure them all. And as we reconfigure them, we will also install a new Wi-Fi product. So that's Starlink technology, which will be supported by Thales in our new partnership with Thales. And you will actually have as good as at-home Wi-Fi on board of our airplanes once we have this installed. And that's going to be a complete game changer compared to what is today. And it will be for free for all our loyalty members. So I think this will be a real game changer. And we're the only airline in Canada that will install this type of internet service. So that's great. Then we will be delivering on a big loyalty upgrade. So we've been working on our loyalty program that has been pretty unchanged for the last 15 years. And we are now working with major improvement of our loyalty program. So stay tuned. There will be some exciting stuff coming up that will be very beneficial for all our loyalty members and will also grow the member base. So that's also exciting. So there are lots of exciting things that are going to happen next year. And we will see quite some growth. Sunwing used to have a very unique business model where they fly in winter with their airline. And then over the summer, they actually don't really have a business for their aircraft. So they were sending a fleet of airplanes to Europe to fly in Europe for some European airlines. So now as we integrate this, we can actually have all those airplanes as WestJet airplanes flying people in Canada. So this in itself, even if Boeing doesn't deliver a single additional airplanes, these planes that don't go to Europe anymore but fly for WestJet, they will deliver a significant amount of growth into the summer of 2025, which we are also looking forward to be deploying and which will be very beneficial to many Canadians. So there are lots of things we are really, really excited about and will be great for our guests, for our communities, and also for our company. Also, something unexpected will happen. I'm not naive, but overall, for the most part, we are very, very confident and positive.
Yeah, well, hopefully no more hailstorms and those sorts of crazy events.
I think that was really a generational thing. In the almost 30 years of our company's history, there's been never an event that was even close to this hailstorm.
Alexis, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. And
no, thanks a lot, and thanks for everyone who was dialing in, and looking forward to another exciting year, and especially also with the BCA. So thanks, Adam.
Well, thank you, Alexis. Thank you for joining us for this episode of C-Suite Unplugged, an Alberta Better podcast series. This podcast is a production of the Business Council of Alberta. You can learn more about us at businesscouncilab.com. We'd love to connect with you on social media, so give us a follow at BizCouncilAB, that's B-I-Z, Council AB, on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. If you like this episode and want to support our message of shared prosperity for all, please be sure to head over to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts to subscribe, rate the show, and give us a quick review. New episodes drop every other Tuesday. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.